Hi, and welcome to Dear SQL DBA, a podcast for SQL Server database administrators. I'm Kendra Little. This week, I'm talking about a question that is really close to me and is about something that I have struggled with a lot over the years. Here it is. Dear SQL DBA, where do you get your creativity from? I love your training sessions. I first saw you in online training, and I now read your blog, but what I love most here is your art. Well, thank you very much for the kind words, and the question means a lot to me because for years I did not devote much time to trying to be a more creative person, and I have been really working on this for the past year. And I feel like I've learned a lot about how to encourage and build creativity because I don't believe that creativity is a talent or a gift. And I think there are really practical things that we can do to become more creative people. And I also feel like this is a really critical skill for people who work with databases and with any kind of software, that creativity is extremely valuable. So the first step to being a creative person is to encourage yourself to be creative and to try to not overemphasize discouraging or negative things, comments that you might make to yourself or notice from other people. And to kind of give you, after this question came in, I had a recent sort of aha moment just about creativity itself and about teaching and how much of a difference being creative can make. I went to a really small college. I think there was 13 people in my graduating class, super small, weirdly small. And I am in contact with a lot of people who I went to school with on Facebook, like most people. And a bunch of us who went to my little school do education of one type or another now. We aren't really full-time teachers, but we give presentations or, we teach things or speak at conferences type stuff. Some people are actual legitimate teachers too. But there was a comment made by a friend of mine who said she was teaching some chemistry students, and what they all really remarked on in her class was the times when she used cat pictures and cat drawings really made a difference to them. She would use them to emphasize particular things that they really needed to pay attention to. And the class really embraced it to the point where they would doodle on her whiteboard for her and kind of use the cat symbol as a way to sort of show their engagement with the class. And it helped them connect to one another. And it made a huge difference in the dynamics of the course. Reading that from her made me really think about, well, I use drawings and illustrations, and how have I heard the feedback people have given me? And I realized that I had really, in my head, mentally distorted a lot of the feedback about my creativity. And here's what I mean by that. So I've presented a fair amount over the last 5 years at conferences and private training sessions and online webcasts. And when you do this, you get a lot of feedback. And I have, among that feedback, received 2 negative comments specifically about how I used drawings. Now, I've received lots of other criticisms about different things, and I don't remember them all specifically. I try to be good about reading the comments and figuring out what I can act on and improving where I can. But I remember these 2 criticisms about how I use drawings very clearly. I know exactly the medium they came in and what course they were about. And they were professional, they weren't mean. But what they essentially said was, the drawings are childish and they don't really add anything. We're grown-ups, treat us like grown-ups. So 2 people gave me negative comments about my artwork, and I really I was very vulnerable about that. I don't want to say like I took it personally, it's not like I thought I'm a bad person about it, but those comments did mean that I didn't spend as much time doing drawings, and I didn't feel that good about them, and I felt a lot more vulnerable every time I used them. And what I didn't pay attention to was that in the feedback I got, which is full of good and bad things, but that many of the things that people thought to say that they liked about my presentations was they took the time to say, the drawings made it fun. And when things are fun, it's easier to stay awake and pay attention. Or that a drawing or a poster of an illustration of something helped them understand something better because they're a visual learner. Or even just that the drawings were what made my session stand out to me, and they just wanted to say, hey, I liked it. There were a bunch of people whose comments were, they were actually taking the time to try to share with me, hey, this is your brand, and being a creative person is good for you. This is what makes you special. Work on that, celebrate it. And I didn't hear those with the same volume as I heard the two comments, the much more smaller comments about the drawings are childish. That's because I think a lot of us are more vulnerable about creative topics. How many times have you said or have heard someone say, well, I can't draw? Like you get started and you can hardly get going because you have this voice in your head that says, I can't do that. Because in our culture, we're embarrassed to sing, or we're embarrassed to kind of think outside the box or be different or try something new. It is much more vulnerable to suggest something that isn't what we've always done, or to do something creative. And it's not bad that people gave me that negative criticism. The mistake was that I didn't take it in proportion because of that inner voice, right? And that's something that, to be a more creative person, you need to work to amplify the positive comments too. And that's something that I try to be more conscious about now and say, no matter how I teach, it's not going to be perfect for everybody. But how can I use drawings and illustrations and creativity and problem solving? How can I use that in my best way to best help the people who do learn well and connect to that, right? Because we can't always be perfect for everyone. Creativity, even if you aren't teaching, even if you aren't doing drawings, I think creativity is huge for database work though, because this whole idea of being able to have a different perspective, to think new ways to approach things is just increasingly relevant. So we have problems that we need to solve, new code that needs to be written, new applications that need to be built. What should we do inside the database? What should we do in application services? Should we use the cloud? Should we virtualize? We have more and more ingredients in our architecture that as a database administrator, you don't have to learn everything about them, but you need to be able to connect with them and conceptualize them and ask the right questions about them to be able to work with your team and come up with the right solution, because not every peg fits into the database hole, and not everything should. The database isn't the best at solving every problem. And even when it is the best at solving a problem, we need to be creative in how we write the code and how it gets run and how we tune it. We don't need to write code the exact same way we've always written it. Just because we have always used a table variable doesn't mean that it's always the best solution, that kind of thing. When we come up with automation, when we come up with monitoring, and when we come up with processes, it always benefits you to be able to sort of have a new idea and consider a new way to do something, Even if you go back and do it the old way, which is sometimes the best way, that insight from considering doing it differently is hugely valuable. And even with communication, so often the folks who work with databases have been isolated historically from other teams, from other people in IT, from developers. There's a hard time communicating and working between these teams many times. More and more, you need to break through that and develop relationships with people on these other teams who you don't always report to the same people, you don't always have the same goals, but more and more, there are problems that you can solve for them and they can solve for you, and your life gets easier if you can go outside of the normal communication rounds and come up with a way to figure out, hey, we can actually benefit from one another and collaborate on these projects. But a lot of times it does take real creativity on your part to figure out who are the right people to talk with and how you can make that connection with them and get out of those old team biases. And some of the biases you may have been involved with personally yourself in the past. Creativity is a huge part of reimagining just the way we relate to other people at work. And it can get you out of this relationship rut and into a better cooperation that makes your life easier. So how do we encourage not just doing the same things the same ways and having the same problems? I think there are real habits that make a huge difference just on how you approach these things mentally. The biggest thing I have found in the last year to help me be more creative is not, I would not have predicted this a year ago, my number one recommendation on how to find more creativity is to physically exercise every day. And that seems like it's somehow not related, right? Because it's like you're not even using your brain as much as your body. And that is kind of part of the benefit. So this has really worked for me. And part of the point is that, to me, what I have found is that the enemy of creativity is stress. Stress and creativity are polar opposites for me. And if I am feeling stressed and I sit down and work, I can plug through something, but it's incredibly difficult to be creative because I'm very likely to just worry over and over again about whatever is stressing me. Exercise is the best thing I have found for breaking down stress. If I go and do a workout, I am very likely to stop thinking about what is stressing me out for a while and have a different perspective on it after the workout. Part of this is that it makes you disconnect. Another part, I very much believe, is that it physically relocates you outside of your work environment. And for me, a lot of my thought patterns are really tied to the spaces I'm in. So walking, and when I say exercise and working out, I do a variety of different exercises, but I am a huge believer in just walking regularly every day as a form of exercise. Incredibly good for my brain and good for my body and builds my creativity. So I don't mean that this has to be like a high intensity workout. Walking is a habit that I now have that I want to have daily in my life for the rest of my life. And one of the big benefits it provides is creativity. So this is, I think, just a huge differential. If you can work it into your work environment, if there are people who you can have your meeting while you're taking a walk, if you have like a one-on-one meeting, can you have the conversation while you walk? It can be something that the more you can work it into your day, the more it will build not only your creativity, but other people if you're doing it while you're having the meeting. I guess it's, there's like a tradition of disclaimers for any time you talk about exercise on the internet. You're supposed to say, I'm not a doctor, which I'm not a doctor, and you should talk to your doctor if you have never walked before and start walking, right? But that's just internet tradition there. So my main habit for creativity is exercise. My second habit is to make notes to capture creative ideas. So I often find I have a lot of ideas while I'm taking that walk or shortly thereafter. And I try to note them down. And I actually, for me, find that how I record them doesn't matter that much. I have a lot of physical Post-it notes scattered around. I have little notebooks with ideas. And eventually all these ideas, I'll end up at the end of the week with kind of paper everywhere in my office or in my pockets. I'll try to get those all I like Google Keep, which is sort of like electronic Post-it notes. I'll try to get them in there. But just the act of writing them down seems to help me a lot. Capturing them in some way and recording them helps those ideas not just sort of dissipate, never to be seen again, because you do want a list. And in my list, I have blog post ideas. I have presentations I'm interested in writing, articles I'm interested in reading, random questions, people I would like to talk to, just whatever. And I can organize them and I can look through them, and that generates a ton of ideas when I look through those. I particularly value what I call tangent ideas. When I'm in the zone and I'm working on something, and a lot of the times I really struggle with writing good demo code. I think everybody who's ever written a demo struggles with writing good demo code. You'll be trying to illustrate something and get a query that illustrates something you've seen in the real world, but against a sample data set that isn't the same. And, I'll be trying to illustrate a problem with an implicit conversion, for example, and I'm writing a query and I'm working with it, and I realize it doesn't illustrate what I wanted it to, but it is a great example for something else. Oh, look, I have illustrated a query getting slower after you add an index or something like that. I've become very much focused on when those happy things happen, a happy accident, as the painter Bob Ross might say, of saving them off, saving the code off in a different file and making a note of had great query example of X, here is where I stored it. The reason I've gotten better at that is because those happy accidents often are better than the thing I was actually trying to demo. But I have a reason to finish the original thing. But when you have these tangent ideas, the things that they just come into your head and are just mildly related to what you're working on, those are often really awesome creative ideas, and getting into the habit of capturing them is really incredibly valuable. So however you do it, whether it's a little notebook or Post-it notes or a phone app, just whatever works for you, that's such a rich source of creativity. Another huge source of creativity, and you can't talk about creativity without talking about other people. A lot of creativity is about thinking about ways to do things that you haven't thought of before and finding other perspectives. The greatest source of other perspectives that there is other people, because we all think really differently. And asking other people, hey, what kind of interesting problems have you solved lately? Or just even so next week I'll be going to the SQL Pass Summit in Seattle. I'll get to meet a lot of new people. And the thing that I hope that I remember to ask people is, so what kind of problems do you get to solve in your job? It's more specific than asking, so what do you do? And it's more interesting to think about and talk about and learn about, to listen to, hey, what are the challenges that you face in your industry or in technology? And what have you tried to do to fix it? What works and what doesn't work? What victories have you had and what challenges have you had? What's still hard? Those are the kind of things that really can spur creative ideas for you later on, because learning how other people solve problems is kind of like just creative magic. because it gives you that little insight into a way to make things work that isn't just the one you already have. So if you get to go to the SQL Pass Summit, that's a great question to kind of try to keep track of all week. And even if you can't go to the conference itself, they will be broadcasting a whole track of sessions live on the internet on the Pass TV. So if you search for Pass TV, you can watch sessions live. A lot of sessions are actually written around, I have a problem, I need to solve it, what do I do to solve it? And they're either real world stories or recommendations. And when you watch the presenter, you get this view of how they solve problems. So check that out. Even if you can't attend the conference, great free source of learning. So those are my recommendations. So let's see if I can remember them. Physical exercise, capturing your ideas when you have them, for me, often during or shortly after exercise, and really paying attention to those tangent ideas and capturing those as well, and focusing on listening to others and asking other people about how they solve problems. That's really my creative food that I try to give my brain. If you have different habits or different ways that you approach creativity, I would love for you to visit littlekendra.com and to leave a comment on the post for this episode. You can click on Dear SQL DBA in the header and find a link to the episode, or you can search Kendra Little and what is the title of this episode? Where do you get your creativity? Is the title of this episode. I would love to hear from you on the blog. If you are going to be at the SQL Pass Summit next week too, and we cross paths, I would love it for you to say hi and tell me that you listen to the podcast. If you listen to the podcast, I'm really curious to see if I have a listener who I run into next week, and I hope to see you soon. Oh, podcast episode. I'm going to attempt to record an episode from the summit. We will see if the quality is good enough to be able to publish. It's a really busy week, so I hope to be back next week. If not, I'll be back in 2 weeks. I'll see you soon.